Welcome. Small Things Forgotten is a small podcast about archaeology. The small parts. The people and places that even archaeologists might not remember, although once you mention it, they might recall it. Archaeology is about remembering at its most basic definition. To remember. To put the pieces back together. Objects allow us to see into the past, not through the writings of people who were communicating their particular view of the world, but through human actions that affected the material world in a broad and more general way. This was written by James Deetz, one of the first American archaeologists to steer away from the archaeology of the high and mighty and the history books, and to focus on the daily lives of the everyday people who never got a mention. He was interested in how cultural changes could be seen by looking at the material culture of the archaeological record. James Deetz was born in 1930 in Cumberland, Maryland, and self-identified as a hillbilly who went to Harvard. In 1959, he was the assistant director of the Plymouth Plantation Museum in Massachusetts. As he described it, it was terrible. Mannequins in all the houses, red metal foil embers, rubber fish, sawdust cornmeal. And what struck me was that the visitors would spend something like 45 seconds in each house. I mean, there was nothing to see. He made dramatic changes to the museum by removing anything that would not have been seen at the settlement in 1637. That included any signage or museum cards. He also got rid of the mannequins posed in the tableau. So instead of visitors being given a tour through the site guided by docents who were giving a lecture about a static exhibit, there were people who were dressed in period costume, who talked about life during the time and answered visitors' questions. His work changed the way history was presented in museums. One of Deetz's projects that never came to be was the Parting Ways Museum of African American Ethnohistory. It was to be another living history museum based on a settlement of freed slaves. In 1975, Deetz led an excavation of the settlement site where African Americans who were given their freedom after serving in the Revolutionary War. The archaeological crew consisted mainly of local African American kids who, during the process, learned about their own heritage. Although the museum was never built, the project was one of the first examples of a public outreach program in archaeology and to focus on African American archaeology. Deetz was also a pioneer in digital archaeology. After the excavations of the Medicine Crow site in central South Dakota, he had over 2,000 rim sherds from the ceramics made by the Arakawa people. Normally, all the pieces would have been sorted by hand without any technological assistance. Instead, he considered how computers could aid in archaeology, and so he wrote a program for an IBM mainframe computer. The program could identify and sort potsherds into different types by identifying stylistic coherence, and sped up the work considerably. Keep in mind that a mainframe computer at that time recorded data on paper punch cards. It ran on transistors, and the machine itself took up 2,000 to 10,000 square feet. Now, before we start pigeonholing Deetz as an academic with a talent for technology, we have to think that this was a man who, when you looked at him, would look more like a latter-day cowboy than a professor. He wore a cowboy hat and rode a horse to remote sites. He also played the banjo. He was outspoken and always emphasized that archaeology was about people and not about the pottery and pipe stems. He also was one of the first to debunk the American myths surrounding Thanksgiving in his article, The Reality of the Pilgrim Fathers. In his most popular book, In Small Things Forgotten, Deetz forgoes writing about the excavations of the houses of important or famous people and instead focuses on the lives of regular, ordinary people. As with his earlier work in museums and excavating, he wrote about the lives and deaths of people who were left out of the history books. The book focuses on the interpretation of the material culture of the people who lived in small settlements, and Native Americans and African Americans. He explains how small changes in material culture can indicate greater cultural change. In his chapter on gravestones, Deetz records the changes in the carvings and styles in New England cemeteries. He followed the transition of the winged skull, or the death's head of the Orthodox Puritanism that stressed bodily decay and the grim reality of death, to the gentler cherub's face, surrounded by wings. The gradual change represented a move away from the more fundamentalist religion of hellfire and damnation, with the promise of resurrection and heavenly reward. Another change, made towards the end of the 18th century, reflected the secularization of religion. At this time, the cherub was replaced by an urn under a weeping willow tree. Changes in epitaphs, what was written on the gravestone, also changed, with messages that were less severe. He also noted that the stylistic changes in the carving, indicating a new generation of stonemasons, or that the loss of a local stonemason meant that the gravestone had to be brought from elsewhere. Throughout his career, Deetz ran field schools and taught at several universities, often commuting from coast to coast to keep up with teaching at the University of California in Santa Barbara and his work at the Plymouth Museum. The list of universities where he taught is impressive. In addition to Santa Barbara, he also taught at Harvard, Brown University, William and Mary, the University of Cape Town in South Africa, the U of C at Berkeley, and the University of Virginia. His invitation to archaeology is a handbook for the beginning archaeologist. Like in Small Things Forgotten, it is short and to the point, explaining how archaeologists choose a site for excavation, the principles of stratigraphy and seriation, relative dating, and interpretation. Deetz's books are small, slender things. You'd almost mistake them for something written for kids or young adults. They're written so that anyone can read and understand them. That doesn't mean they're dumbed down, but it means that archaeology isn't meant just for the elite in society. Like his work that focused on the day-to-day life of regular humans, his writing is also accessible to everyone. This podcast is produced without ads, and the only sponsors are those wonderful people who contribute to my Patreon. If you enjoy this podcast and would like to support it, check out patreon.com/archaeology. Even $1 or $2 a month will help keep this podcast going. I also have a website, Ancient Tools and Craft. It's a webpage about experimental archaeology, making things and the tools people use to make them. Thanks for listening, and now go out and have some fun.